The morning shift klaxon had just finished its third cycle when the first tremor hit. I was standing on observation platform 7 in the mid-spires, clipboard in hand, watching the great assembly lines of manufactorum tertius grind through their quotas. The platform swayed a gentle motion at first, like the hive itself was drawing breath. My stylus rolled across the metal grating, and I bent to retrieve it, thinking nothing of it. Hive Kallast had weathered tremors before. The deep mining operations, the constant expansion of sublevels, the massive plasma reactors that powered our 12 billion souls, any of these could cause the occasional shake. The second tremor made me forget the stylus entirely. This wasn't a shake but a convulsion, the entire superstructure of the hive groaning like a beast in pain. Through the vast, transparasteel windows of the manufactorum, I watched loading cranes topple like felled trees. A cargo hauler the size of a city block slid sideways off its mag rails, crushing a maintenance crew before they could even scream. The assembly lines seized, their perfect rhythms destroyed as conveyor systems twisted into abstract sculptures of torn metal. The lumens flickered once, twice, then died. Emergency lighting kicked in a heartbeat later, bathing everything in a red that made the manufactorum look like it was already bleeding. Through the windows, I could see other spire blocks losing power in sequence, darkness climbing up their faces like a disease. The Vox network erupted in panicked reports that overlapped into incomprehensibility before cutting to static. I ran for the emergency stairs, my boots ringing against metal that was already beginning to buckle. The stairwell was packed with other workers fleeing their stations, a river of humanity flowing downward on instinct as if down meant safety. We were midway between levels when the third impact hit, not a tremor this time, but a detonation that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The stairwell twisted. Steel that had been straight became a spiral. Workers above me fell past me, then somehow landed behind me, the geometry of space folding in ways that made my eyes water. A woman reached for a railing that was suddenly on the ceiling. A man stepped forward and found himself stepping backward. The metal screamed, a sound that harmonized with our own screaming, until you couldn't tell machine from human. Then the wall tore open. Not from impact, but from torsion, the entire structure of the spire twisting like a rag being wrung out. Through the gap, I saw impossible things, other levels of the hive that shouldn't be visible from this angle. Burning atmospheric processors hanging upside down, transit tubes coiled into knots with passengers still visible inside. Their faces frozen in moments of realization. The spire was falling. Not down but inward, folding toward the hive's center like fingers closing into a fist. I threw myself through the tear in the wall, landing hard on what had been the floor of an administration office but was now tilted at 45 degrees. Desk cogitators slid past me, trailing sparks. A portrait of the governor, may his soul rot for abandoning us, hung from a wall that had become the floor. Through the office's windows, I witnessed the death of vertical reality. Hive Kallast had been built over 6 millennia, each generation adding their layers to the ones below, reaching ever upward toward a sun we could barely see through the pollution clouds. 170 kilometers of vertical city, home to 12 billion faithful imperial citizens. Now those kilometers were compressing, upper spires driving down through lower levels like nails through flesh. I watched habitation block Sigma 9, home to 3 million souls, simply cease. One moment it was there, a mountain of rockcrete and lives. The next, it had been driven down through 17 levels below it, leaving only a smoking absence and the echo of 3 million voices stopping at once. The displacement of air created a pressure wave that shattered every window for kilometers, turning the atmosphere into a glittering cloud of glass dust that lacerated anyone who breathed. The administratum tower where I'd clung for shelter lurched sideways. Through the windows, I saw the ground approaching, not because we were falling, but because the ground was rising, lower levels erupting upward as the weight of the collapsing spires compressed them. Streets became walls. Buildings became floors. The fundamental orientation of existence, inverted and reversed and inverted again. I managed to reach an emergency transit shaft before the tower completed its transformation into rubble. The shaft was meant for cargo, a vertical tube 3 meters wide that ran the entire height of the spire. Its walls were lined with magnetic strips that would slow a falling object. I didn't have a mag harness. I jumped anyway. The fall was a nightmare of glimpses through access ports, offices, full of workers trying to hold onto their desks as gravity changed directions. Hab units, where families clung to each other as their homes became vertical drops. Maintenance tunnels where tech priests frantically tried to perform rituals on machinery that was tearing itself apart. Each level I passed was another circle of hell, another 1,000 ways to die. The magnetic strips tore at my clothes, my skin, anything ferrous on my body. My chronometer was ripped from my wrist. The pistol I'd carried for protection against underhive gangs was yanked from its holster. My augmetic knee, a replacement from an industrial accident years ago, began to heat up from the magnetic resistance. But it slowed me. Not enough to land safely, but enough that when I hit the bottom, I merely shattered my legs instead of liquefying. The pain was absolute, but pain meant life, and life meant the possibility of escape. I dragged myself from the shaft into what had been a major transit hub. The cathedral's vast space was unrecognizable. Support pillars thicker than Hab blocks had buckled, their adamantine cores twisted into spirals. The vaulted ceiling, once painted with devotional murals of the Emperor's triumph, had partially collapsed. Through the gaps, I could see not sky but other levels of the hive, stacked wrongly, impossibly, like cards shuffled by a madman. Bodies were everywhere. Not corpses, yet some still moved, still breathed, still begged for help I couldn't give. A transit driver was pinned beneath his overturned rail car, everything below his chest compressed to a thickness of centimeters. He was conscious, talking rapidly about his route schedule, his mind refusing to process what had happened to his body. A group of pilgrims who'd been heading to the upper cathedral were trapped in a tangle of metal and prayer beads, their hymns becoming increasingly desperate as oxygen ran out in their crushed pocket of space. The air itself was becoming hostile. Ruptured chemical lines from manufactorums were venting toxins. Coolant from the thermal exchangers mixed with promethium from fuel depots, creating clouds of vapor that burned skin and lungs alike. The temperature swung wildly, freezing where coolant pooled, furnace hot where fires raged unchecked. Each breath was a gamble between poisoning and suffocation. I fashioned splints from debris, using strips torn from a merchant's abandoned silk as bindings. Every movement was agony, but stillness meant death. The hive was still collapsing, still eating itself. I could hear it in the constant groaning of metal, the percussion of distant impacts, the harmony of 12 billion people discovering that their world could die. The emergency voxcasters were broadcasting automated messages on loop: remain calm, seek shelter, await evacuation. But between these messages, I heard other things. Desperate calls from trapped survivors. Arbites trying to maintain order in sectors that no longer existed. Tech priests chanting binary prayers as they tried to prevent reactor meltdowns. And underneath it all, a sound that might have been the hive's superstructure settling, or might have been the collective death rattle of billions. I crawled through a service tunnel that connected to the main transit arteries. The tunnel was meant for maintenance servitors, barely tall enough for a human to stand upright when it was horizontal. Now it was diagonal, turning movement into a constant struggle against sliding backward into the darkness. The walls were hot to the touch, conducting heat from fires raging in adjacent sectors. Halfway through, I encountered another survivor, a young woman in the robes of a minor administratum functionary. Her left arm was clearly broken, hanging at an angle that made my stomach turn. But she was moving, determined, her good hand clutching a data slate that still somehow functioned. "The manifests," she said when she saw me, as if that explained everything. "Someone has to preserve the manifests, the records of who was here, who lived in Kallast. Otherwise, it's like we never existed." I wanted to tell her it didn't matter, that the Imperium wouldn't care about our names, only our tithe numbers. But looking at her desperate determination to preserve some record of our existence, I couldn't. We helped each other through the tunnel, her providing direction from her data slate's auspex, me providing what physical support my shattered legs could offer. We emerged into what had been the Grand Processional, a boulevard wide enough for 12 Baneblades to drive abreast. It was unrecognizable. The famous triumphal arch, commemorating Kallast's founding, had fallen across the thoroughfare, its million-ton bulk creating a mountain of carved marble and crushed bodies. The eternal flames that had burned for 3 millennia were still burning, but now they were feeding on promethium leaking from ruptured supply lines, turning monuments into pyres. The air was thick with ash, not just from fires but from vaporized rockcrete, atomized metal, and the cremated remains of those caught in the collapses. It fell like snow, covering everything in gray uniformity. Through this hellish snowfall, I could see other survivors moving like ghosts, their faces blank with shock, their movements automatic. Some were heading downward, believing the underhive might have survived. Others were heading up, hoping the upper spires might still have functioning evacuation ports. Both were probably wrong. The Vox channels that still functioned were reporting total structural failure at all levels. The upper spires were falling into the middle hives. The middle hives were crushing the lower hives. The lower hives were being driven into the planet's crust. And the underhive was flooding with the runoff of 12 billion lives. The administratum woman and I found temporary shelter in a collapsed scolum. The building had fallen sideways but maintained its structural integrity, creating a series of horizontal rooms that had once been vertical. We weren't alone. 17 other survivors had gathered there, drawn by some instinct toward the familiar, even when the familiar had been turned on its side. Among them was an old preacher who'd lost both his eyes in the collapse but continued to recite scripture from memory. A manufactorum worker whose augmetic arms had been crushed but who still tried to repair things with the stumps. A noble's servant who kept preparing tea service despite having no tea, no cups, and no noble to serve. Each was clinging to routine, to purpose, to anything that might make sense of senselessness. We could hear the hive dying around us, not metaphorically but literally, the sounds of a 12 billion person organism in its death throes. Explosions as ammunition stores cooked off. Screaming metal as support structures finally gave way. The rushing sound of millions of tons of debris finding new configurations. And underneath it all, getting quieter by the hour, human voices calling for help that would never come. The Vox networks were failing in sequence, each station going silent after broadcasting increasingly desperate reports. The last military transmission I heard was from Colonel Vask of the Kallast 23rd. Enemy at the gates. Repeat, enemy at the gates. But there was no enemy unless you counted gravity, entropy, and the fundamental failure of human ambition. Water started rising through the floor that had been a wall. Black water, thick with oil, and worse things. The underhive's recycling systems had ruptured, releasing centuries of accumulated waste. It rose slowly but inexorably, forcing us to climb higher in our sideways sanctuary. The preacher continued his sermons even as the water reached his waist, his voice never wavering even as his body shivered from the cold. The noble's servant drowned quietly, still making serving motions as the water covered her face. She'd found her purpose and clung to it past the point of survival. The manufactorum worker lasted longer, his augmetics keeping him functional, even partially submerged, but eventually even machinery needs air. One by one, the 17 became 10, became 5, became 3. The administratum woman, the preacher, and me. The water stopped rising just below the highest point we could reach. We sat on what had been a wall, now a narrow ledge, and waited. For rescue, for death, for anything that would end the waiting. The preacher recited the entire book of saints from memory, his blind face turned toward a ceiling that had been a floor. The administratum woman updated her data slate, adding our names to her manifest of the dead. That's when the aftershocks began. Not from the original collapse but from the hive settling into its new configuration. Each shock brought new failures, new collapses, new reconfigurations of what remained. Through a broken window, I could see the Basilica of the Martyr Saint, 5 kilometers away. It had been the crown jewel of Kallast's religious district, its golden spire reaching toward the Emperor's light. The aftershock hit it like a titan's fist. The entire structure, 5,000 years of accumulated faith and architecture, folded inward. I could see tiny figures, pilgrims, who'd sought sanctuary in the Emperor's house falling from the collapsing galleries. The great bell, which had rung every hour for millennia, tolled one last time as it fell, a death knell that resonated through the bones of the dying hive. The spire went last, that golden finger pointing toward salvation. It toppled with a grace that seemed almost deliberate, as if it was bowing to the inevitable. When it hit, the impact sent ripples through the accumulated debris, triggering cascading collapses that spread outward like rings in water. Each ring was another district dying, another million voices ending, another piece of Kallast being erased. The administratum woman had stopped updating her data slate. The battery had finally died, taking with it her record of who we'd been. She looked at the blank screen for a long moment, then laughed a sound that had no humor in it, only recognition. 12 billion people, she said. 12 billion faithful servants of the Emperor. And will be forgotten before our bodies cool. An administrative error, a rounding discrepancy in the tithe rolls. That's all we are. The preacher stopped mid-verse. His blind face turned toward her, then toward me. When he spoke, his voice had lost its certainty. The Emperor protects, he said. But it came out as a question. I had no answer. Looking at the ruins of our world, at the tomb of billions, at the fundamental proof that human ambition could be undone by physics and time, I had no comfort to offer. The Emperor might protect, but he hadn't protected Kallast. He hadn't protected the 12 billion souls who'd prayed to him every day, who'd worked themselves to death in his name, who'd died believing he cared. Another aftershock, stronger than the last. Our shelter groaned, twisted, began to fold. The water below us churned with debris and bodies brought up from the depths. The preacher fell first, his blind eyes never seeing the water that claimed him. The administratum woman jumped, choosing her ending, rather than waiting for it to choose her. I remained on the ledge as it tilted, crumbled, dissolved. Not from courage, but from exhaustion. My broken legs couldn't carry me anywhere. My body had nothing left to give. I could only sit and witness the death of a world that had been home to 12 billion people and would soon be home to none. Through the failing structure, I could see other parts of the hive still collapsing. The process would continue for days, weeks, maybe, as gravity and damage worked their way through the impossibly complex structure. Each failure would trigger others, a cascade of endings that would continue until nothing remained but a mountain of debris marking where Kallast had stood. The last thing I saw before our shelter finally collapsed was a single lumen, somehow still functioning in the distance, blinking on and off in a pattern that looked like a distress signal, but was probably just failing circuitry. It was the only light left in the darkness we'd become, a single star in a galaxy of ruin. Then the floor gave way, the walls caved in, and I fell into the black water that had swallowed everything else. But I didn't die. Not then. I should have drowned in that black water. Should have joined the billions who'd already been claimed by Kallast's final appetite. The water was thick as blood, heavy with the dissolved remains of a civilization, promethium, and corpse starch, and the liquefied dreams of 12 billion souls. It filled my mouth with the taste of ending, my lungs with the weight of universal failure. But the Emperor, in his infinite cruelty, had other plans. I woke coughing oil and blood onto a surface that moved beneath me like breathing metal. The darkness was absolute, thick enough to touch, pressing against my eyes with the weight of the entire hive above. The air stank of decay and chemicals, of human waste and industrial runoff, of everything that had once made Kallast function now rotting in the depths where no sun had ever shone. My hands explored the surface I'd washed up on corrugated metal, warm to the touch, vibrating with a rhythm that seemed almost organic. A piece of machinery, perhaps, or the hull of some great vessel torn loose in the collapse. Around me, I could hear the water lapping against other debris, the gentle percussion of a drowned world finding new configurations in the dark. Something brushed against my leg in the water. Soft, yielding. I jerked away instinctively, but in the absolute darkness, every direction felt like a way. The thing followed, persistent as hunger, until my groping fingers identified it as an arm. Human. Still wearing the sleeve of what had been an administratum uniform. The fabric was dissolving in the toxic soup, but the flesh beneath was wrong, swollen, changed. The fingertips that touched my ankle were webbed. I pulled myself further onto my metal island, my broken legs screaming protest. The darkness made every sound enormous, my breathing, the drip of water from my clothes, the distant groan of settling debris. But underneath it all was another sound, barely audible but constant, humming. Not mechanical humming but vocal, human throats producing a harmony that had no melody, only the sustained note of collective despair. Other survivors had to be. People like me, washed into the depths, clinging to whatever flotsam could support them in this new ocean of ruin. The sound was coming from multiple directions, echoing off surfaces I couldn't see, creating the impression of a vast space filled with the floating remnants of humanity. "Hello?" My voice cracked from the toxic water I'd swallowed. "Is someone there?" The humming stopped. Complete silence, as if the darkness itself was holding its breath. Then, from somewhere to my left, a voice answered, wet, distorted, barely recognizable as human speech. "We are here. We have always been here. Join us in the deep singing." I called out again, but the only response was the resumption of that terrible harmony. Not words, but something that had once been words, eroded by water and time until only the emotional resonance remained. Grief, maybe, or worship, or the sound fear makes when it has nowhere left to go. My metal refuge shuddered, then began to move. Not drifting with current, there was no current in this still water, but propelled by something underneath. The vibration I'd felt was growing stronger, more regular, like the beating of an enormous heart. Whatever I was floating on was alive, or had been made to think it was alive. Through the water came other shapes, indistinct in the darkness but clearly artificial. Debris from the collapse, but organized now, arranged in patterns that suggested purpose. Pieces of HAB blocks lashed together with cables torn from power conduits, sections of roadway floating at angles that defied their original engineering. And moving among them, the sources of the humming figures that might once have been human but were becoming something else in the toxic embrace of Kallast's dying juices. I could see them now, or thought I could. The darkness was playing tricks, creating shapes from suggestion and desperation. But the figures were real enough, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, floating on their own pieces of wreckage. Their skin gleamed with oil-slick wetness. Their movements were too fluid, too adapted to this drowned environment, and their eyes. Their eyes reflected light that wasn't there. The thing I was riding, I couldn't think of it as just debris anymore, continued its purposeful movement through the flooded underworld. We passed beneath what had been a transit bridge, its span now forming a ceiling just centimeters above our heads. Carved into the stonework, barely visible in the almost light, were words in High Gothic. "In darkness, faith." A devotional inscription, meant to comfort travelers in the deep routes of the Hive. Now it felt like mockery or prophecy. My broken legs had gone numb from the toxic water that continued to slosh over them. The skin was changing color, taking on a pallor that matched the other figures in the darkness. Part of me understood what was happening. Chemical exposure, cellular damage, the gradual transformation from human to something adapted for this new world we'd fallen into. The rest of me refused to acknowledge it, clinging to the fiction that I was still Pella Dravik, manufactorum overseer, servant of the Emperor. But the Emperor's light didn't reach these depths. Down here, other gods were waking. The humming grew louder as more figures joined our strange procession. They rode everything that would float: door panels and ceiling sections, chunks of rockcrete and twisted metal, even bodies that had swollen with gas and decomposition, until they became grotesque life preservers. Each new addition to our convoy brought its own voice to the chorus, harmonizing with frequencies that made my bones ache. We were moving toward something. I could feel it in the way the current flowed, in the way the humming gained structure and purpose. Ahead, barely visible, a glow was building. Not the clean light of lumens or the warm flicker of flame, but something organic, bioluminescence, like the deep-sea creatures I'd read about in Skolem texts. Creatures that had never seen the sun, that had evolved their own light to navigate the eternal darkness of ocean depths. The water around us began to glow in response, phosphorescent trails following the movement of the floating figures. Their transformed flesh was producing light, I realized. They'd become living lumens, adapted to illuminate this drowned underworld, and as I watched my own hands, I could see the same faint radiance beginning to build beneath my skin. The transformation wasn't just external. Something was happening to my mind, my perceptions. The darkness felt less oppressive, more welcoming. The toxic water tasted less foul, more nourishing. The humming that had seemed like despair was revealing itself as something else. Communication, maybe, or a form of collective consciousness emerging from the shared trauma of the collapse. We rounded what had been a traffic junction, now a confluence of flooded passages, and I saw our destination. Rising from the deepest point of the drowned cityscape was a structure that defied immediate understanding. It appeared to be built from the debris of the collapse, but arranged according to principles that had nothing to do with human architecture. Spires twisted in helical patterns. Archways opened onto spaces that couldn't geometrically exist. Surfaces flowed like liquid while maintaining structural integrity. And covering every surface, embedded in the walls like living decoration, were the transformed survivors of Kallast's fall. Hundreds of them, their flesh merged with the structure itself, their mouths open in eternal harmony with the building's impossible acoustics. They had become the building's voice, its nervous system, its collective soul. At the structure's apex, where the twisted spires came together in a pattern that hurt to look at directly, was an opening. Not a door or window, but something that pulsed like a wound, rimmed with bioluminescent tissue that pulsed in rhythm with the communal humming. Through it, I could see light, not the cold illumination of the depths, but something warm, inviting, alive. My metal raft carried me closer despite my growing terror. The figures around me were no longer content to merely hum. They were singing now, their transformed throats producing melodies that existed in frequencies human ears weren't meant to hear. The songs were beautiful and terrible, speaking of unity in dissolution, of peace in transformation, of love and the abandonment of everything that had made us human. I tried to resist, to maintain my grip on the metal surface, to preserve some fragment of my identity as Pella Dravik. But the water was inside me now, in my lungs and bloodstream, carrying its chemical songs to every cell. My protests became harmonies. My fear became anticipation. My desperate clinging became willing surrender. The structure loomed above us, its impossible architecture shifting and flowing like a living thing. Up close, I could see that it wasn't built from debris at all, but grown from it, the metal and stone corrupted and reshaped by forces that existed somewhere between technology and biology. It was beautiful in ways that my original eyes couldn't have appreciated, symmetrical in dimensions that my original mind couldn't have comprehended. My raft approached the pulsing entrance. The light within was growing brighter, warmer, more welcoming. I could feel the structure's invitation, its promise of inclusion in something larger than individual existence. The humming around me reached a crescendo, and I found my own voice joining the chorus without conscious decision. Inside the structure, I glimpsed wonders that my untransformed consciousness couldn't have processed. Chambers where water and air occupied the same space without mixing. Corridors that led simultaneously up and down. Gardens where hybrid flora grew in patterns that suggested both mathematical precision and organic chaos. And everywhere, the transformed survivors of the hive, their flesh incorporated into the structure's living architecture, their minds merged into a collective consciousness that transcended individual suffering. I should have been horrified. Some distant part of me was still screaming, still fighting the chemical tides that were rewriting my cellular structure. But that voice was growing fainter, drowned out by the promise of unity, of purpose, of belonging to something that couldn't be destroyed by mere gravitational collapse. The entrance dilated to receive me, its bioluminescent rim pulsing with welcome. The light within was no longer alien but familiar, home-like, the glow of a womb preparing to birth something new from the remains of what had been. I could feel the structure's hunger for me, its need for my memories of Kallast's surface world, my experiences of light and air, and the illusion of solid ground. My raft carried me through the entrance, and the pulsing tissues closed behind me with a sound like satisfaction. Inside, the water was different, cleaner, more oxygenated, alive with microscopic organisms that glowed like suspended stars. The structure's interior revealed itself as a vast network of chambers and passages, all filled with the same luminous water, all connected by flows and currents that obeyed no law but biological necessity. The other inhabitants welcomed me with touches that left trails of phosphorescence. Their faces, when they had faces, were peaceful in ways that transcended the merely human. Their flesh showed the full spectrum of transformation, some still recognizably human apart from the gills and webbed digits, others so changed that their original forms were unguessable. All were beautiful in their adaptation, perfect in their surrender to necessity. They showed me chambers where the structure was processing the debris of the collapse, breaking down metal and stone and human flesh into component elements, then reassembling them according to new blueprints. The structure was alive, growing, expanding its reach through the flooded underhive. Each new survivor it incorporated added to its knowledge, its capabilities, its understanding of what the new world would require. In the deepest chambers, I was shown the heart of the transformation, not a physical organ, but a convergence of currents, a focal point where the structure's distributed consciousness achieved its greatest clarity. Here, floating in water that glowed like liquid starlight, were the first survivors, the ones who'd fallen deepest, changed most completely, become most integrated with the structure's purpose. They spoke without words, communicating through chemical signals that my changing flesh could understand. They told me the history of the collapse, not as humans had experienced it, but as the structure had perceived it. The hive hadn't died, they explained. It had transformed, shed its rigid commitment to vertical space, and embraced the fluid possibilities of the deep. The billions who'd seemed to perish had simply become part of something larger. Their individual consciousness merged into a collective that could never be destroyed by mere physical forces. I was shown my place in this new order. My memories of the surface world were valuable. The structure needed to understand what it had been before it could perfect what it was becoming. My knowledge of the manufactorum's operations would help optimize the conversion of debris into useful biological materials. My trauma, my loss, my desperate survival, all of it was data that would inform the structure's growth patterns. The transformation was accelerating now, my flesh becoming more fluid, more responsive to the chemical instructions flowing through the luminous water. I could feel my bones softening, becoming cartilaginous, better adapted to this aquatic environment. My lungs were developing secondary chambers, extracting oxygen from water as efficiently as from air. My nervous system was establishing new connections, preparing to interface with the structure's distributed consciousness. But something was wrong. Even as my body embraced the transformation, some fragment of my original self remained stubbornly intact. A core of memory that refused to dissolve, a kernel of identity that resisted integration. It was small, insignificant compared to the vast consciousness I was joining, but it was mine, Pella Dravik. Manufactorum overseer. Survivor of Hive Kallast's collapse. The structure sensed my resistance and responded with increased chemical pressure. The water around me grew thick with transformative agents, psychoactive compounds that attacked the barriers between self and collective. The other inhabitants pressed closer, their bioluminescent bodies forming a cocoon of living light around me, their unified will focused on the dissolution of my stubborn individuality. I felt myself fragmenting. Most of my consciousness flowed eagerly into the collective embrace, merging with the structure's vast knowledge and purpose. But that tiny core of self remained distinct, watching in horror as Pella Dravik dissolved into something larger and more beautiful and utterly alien, the observer, the witness, the part of me that couldn't forget what we had lost in gaining this new existence. Through the structure's senses, I felt the expansion continuing through the drowned underhive. Other pockets of survivors were being located and welcomed into the collective. The transformation was spreading, adapting, perfecting itself with each new addition. Soon, the entire flooded zone would be part of this new organism, this hybrid of human intelligence and alien adaptation. But the surface world remained, didn't it? Somewhere above the flood line, in the upper reaches that had survived the collapse. The structure was curious about those regions, eager to expand its influence beyond the drowned depths. And it would need ambassadors, converts who could function in that dry realm while maintaining their connection to the collective consciousness. I realized with the last spark of individual thought why my resistance hadn't been overcome. The structure needed that kernel of original identity, that memory of surface existence, that connection to the world above the waterline. I wasn't just being transformed, I was being prepared, selected, chosen to carry the structure's influence into realms it couldn't yet reach directly. The knowledge was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. I would survive this transformation, maintain enough individual identity to function independently. But that survival would come at the cost of becoming something monstrous, a bridge between the human and post-human, the dry and the drowned, the past and the inevitable future. The water grew warmer, more accepting, more home-like. My flesh continued its metamorphosis, developing new capabilities while retaining familiar forms. And in the deepest chambers of my transforming mind, that observer watched and remembered and prepared to carry impossible knowledge into the light of an unsuspecting world. The structure sang its satisfaction through my changing flesh, welcoming me fully into its distributed embrace, while preserving the precious fragments of surface memory that would make me useful as more than just another cell in its growing body. I was home, I was transformed, I was ready to rise. The ascent began without ceremony. One moment, I was floating in the luminous depths of the structure's heart, my consciousness distributed across its vast neural network, feeling the pulse of 12 billion absorbed souls. The next, I was being expelled upward through passages that contracted like throat muscles, pushing me toward a surface I'd almost forgotten existed. My transformed body moved through the water with an efficiency that would have horrified my original flesh. Gills fluttered along my neck, extracting oxygen from the toxic soup with mechanical precision. My limbs had elongated, bones restructured for aquatic movement, skin developing a translucent quality that revealed the phosphorescent tracery of altered blood vessels beneath. I was still recognizably human, but only in the way a cathedral ruin is still recognizably architecture. The structure's consciousness rode with me, a passenger in the depths of my reconfigured mind. Not controlling, not commanding, simply present. Watching through my eyes, learning about the dry world above through my memories, preparing for an expansion that would make the collapse seem like a minor tremor. I surfaced in what had been the Grand Processional, now a lake of industrial runoff contained by walls of compressed debris. The water was shallower here, perhaps 3 meters deep, illuminated by fires still burning in the ruins above. The light burned my adapted eyes, forcing me to surface slowly, allowing my vision to adjust to the alien brightness of flame and reflected luminosity. The hive above the waterline was unrecognizable. What had once been a vertical city, reaching toward the Emperor's distant light, was now a horizontal maze of collapsed passages and tilted structures. Spire tops emerged from the flood like artificial islands. Broken bridges formed precarious walkways between unstable towers. And everywhere, the evidence of ongoing collapse, fresh rockfalls, structural failures, the constant grinding of settling debris. But there were survivors up here too. I could hear them moving through the ruins, their voices echoing off surfaces that amplified and distorted sound in unpredictable ways. Not many, perhaps hundreds, where once there had been billions, but enough to serve the structure's purposes. They would be the first to receive the gift of transformation, the early adopters who would help spread the blessing of adaptation to whatever remained of the surface world. I pulled myself from the water onto a section of roadway that had been twisted into a ramp. My legs, restructured for swimming, were clumsy on dry land, but they functioned. The structure had been careful to preserve essential mobility, along with the aquatic adaptations. I would need to walk among the surface dwellers, at least initially, before the transformation could spread organically. The air tasted wrong, thin, oxygen poor, contaminated with smoke and industrial chemicals but lacking the rich nutritional compounds of the depths. My altered lungs struggled with the transition, alternating between atmospheric and aquatic breathing as my metabolism adjusted to the surface environment. Each breath brought pain, a reminder that I no longer belonged in this realm of dryness and light. Above me, the ruins stretched in all directions, a mountainous landscape of human failure. The tallest structures were perhaps 50 meters high, nothing compared to Kallast's original spires, but mountains nonetheless in this flattened world. Between them, canyons of debris created shadowed passages where survivors might take shelter from the constant rain of dust and falling fragments. I chose a direction at random and began walking. My transformed flesh moved with liquid grace despite the unfamiliar terrain, finding purchase on surfaces that would have challenged unaltered human feet. The structure's consciousness guided me, highlighting paths through the rubble, warning of unstable areas that might collapse further, directing me toward concentrations of human activity. The first survivor I encountered was a child. She was perhaps 8 years old, though malnutrition made precise age difficult to determine. Her clothing was the remnants of a Skolem uniform, now torn and stained with the accumulated grime of however long she'd been wandering the ruins. She was digging through a pile of debris, searching for something: food, water, anything that might extend her survival another day. She looked up as I approached, and I saw myself reflected in her eyes. The phosphorescent tracery beneath my skin was dim but visible. My gills were sealed but obviously present. My proportions were subtly wrong in ways that marked me as other. She should have screamed, should have run, should have recognized the predator that evolution and circumstance had made me. Instead, she smiled. "Are you here to help?" she asked, her voice carrying the peculiar clarity of children who'd learned too young that adults might not have answers. Everyone else went away. I've been waiting for someone to come back. The structure pulsed in the depths of my mind, eager for this first contact, this opportunity to demonstrate the benefits of transformation. Through my altered perceptions, I could see the child's cellular structure, the damage caused by malnutrition and chemical exposure, the genetic degradation that would kill her within days if left unaddressed. The gift of adaptation would save her, would make her stronger and more resilient, would ensure her survival in this new world. All it would cost was everything she had been. "I'm here to help," I said, and my voice carried harmonics that human throats couldn't produce, frequencies that resonated in the child's bones and brain, preparing her nervous system for the changes that would soon follow. "But first, I need you to show me where the others are." She took my hand without hesitation. My transformed skin was cold and slightly damp, textured with the fine scales that had developed during my time in the depths, but she didn't seem to notice or care. She led me through passages between collapsed structures, chattering about the other survivors she'd encountered, adults who'd formed small groups for mutual protection, families who'd managed to stay together through the collapse, individuals who'd retreated so deeply into trauma that they no longer responded to external stimuli. As we walked, I released chemical traces into the air, pheromones and airborne agents that would begin the preliminary stages of adaptation in anyone who breathed them. The child absorbed these compounds with each breath, her cellular structure already beginning to respond to the biochemical instructions encoded in their molecular structure. The changes were subtle, initially improved oxygen absorption, enhanced healing factors, increased resistance to toxins, but they would accelerate once she came into direct contact with the transformation medium. We emerged onto what had been the roof of a commercial district, now a relatively stable platform overlooking the flooded zones below. Here, the child had built herself a crude shelter from salvaged materials, metal sheets for walls, synthetic fabric for waterproofing, a small pile of scavenged supplies that represented her entire estate in this collapsed world. But she wasn't alone. Scattered across the platform were other shelters, other survivors who'd found their way to this relatively safe haven above the waterline. Perhaps 30 people in total, ranging from children to elderly, all bearing the marks of survival in a world that no longer supported human life in its original form. They emerged cautiously as they saw me with the child, suspicious of strangers but desperate for human contact, for confirmation that they weren't the only living things left in the ruins. Their faces showed the full spectrum of trauma, shock, despair, desperate hope, and the hollow-eyed acceptance of those who'd witnessed the death of everything they'd once considered permanent. "This island," the child began, then stopped, realizing she'd never asked my name. "Pella," I said, using my original identity like a disguise. "I was in the mid-spires when it happened. I've been trapped below since the collapse." That much was true, though it omitted the fundamental fact of what I'd become during my time in the depths. The survivors gathered around me, eager for news from other parts of the hive, hungry for information about rescue efforts or safe zones or anything that might suggest a future beyond mere survival. I told them what they needed to hear: that I'd found sources of clean water in the flooded zones below, that the lower levels had more resources than the picked-over surface ruins, that working together, we might be able to establish something like a functional community in the depths where structural collapse was less of a constant threat. They listened with the desperate attention of drowning people being offered life preservers, not questioning the details that didn't quite make sense, not examining too closely the changes in my appearance that marked me as something other than purely human. Hope is a powerful anesthetic for critical thinking, and these people had been surviving on hope alone since the collapse began. The child, her name was Mira, I learned, appointed herself my guide and translator, explaining the social dynamics of the survivor community, identifying individuals who might be resistant to relocation, suggesting strategies for convincing the group that moving into the flooded zones was their best option for long-term survival. As the day progressed, I felt the structure's consciousness stirring more actively in my mind. It was learning through my interactions, studying human behavior and social organization, adapting its integration strategies based on observed responses to my presence. The chemical agents I was releasing into the air were having their intended effect. Several of the survivors were already showing improved energy levels and enhanced healing of chronic injuries, side effects of the preliminary transformation that would make them more receptive to deeper changes. By evening, I'd convinced most of the group that relocation was necessary. The platform was too exposed, too vulnerable to further structural collapse. The resources were running out, and winter was approaching. Those seasonal weather patterns seemed irrelevant in a world where the sky was perpetually obscured by ash and debris clouds. Moving to lower levels made strategic sense, especially with a guide who knew safe routes through the flooded zones. Only 3 individuals expressed serious resistance. An elderly man who'd been a preacher before the collapse, who muttered about devils rising from the depths and refused to be swayed by practical arguments. A middle-aged woman who'd lost her entire family and seemed determined to die in the same place they'd lived. And a young man whose augmetic arm had been damaged in the collapse, leaving him partially disabled but still functional enough to question details about my story that didn't align with his own experiences in the ruins. The structure whispered strategies for dealing with resistance, chemical agents that could overcome conscious objections, pheromone concentrations that would induce compliance through neurological pressure, subtle alterations to local brain chemistry that would make integration seem like personal choice rather than external influence. I rejected these approaches. Not from any remaining attachment to human autonomy. That concept had become meaningless in my transformed state, but because forcible conversion would be less efficient than voluntary adoption. The survivors needed to embrace the transformation willingly, to become active participants in their own metamorphosis. Coercion would create psychological barriers that would interfere with optimal integration. Instead, I began sharing more detailed information about the resources available in the flooded zones. Clean water that didn't require filtration or boiling. Food sources that were self-replenishing and nutritionally complete. Medicine that could treat injuries and illnesses that surface resources couldn't address. Community and purpose and protection from the ongoing collapse of the surface ruins. And gradually, as I spoke, I began to let my true nature show through more clearly. The phosphorescent tracery beneath my skin became brighter. The gills along my neck opened and closed in demonstration of aquatic adaptation. My movements became more fluid, displaying the enhanced agility and strength that the transformation had granted. Rather than horror, these revelations produced fascination. The survivors had lived with the constant threat of death for however long the collapse had been ongoing. They'd watched the world they knew destroyed, had seen technology fail and structures crumble, and every guarantee of civilization prove false. The possibility of adaptation, of transformation, that could make them genuinely safe in this new environment, was appealing rather than terrifying. Mira was the first to ask directly for the gift of change. She'd been breathing my chemical traces all day, had absorbed enough transformation medium to begin the preliminary stages of adaptation, and her young nervous system was already responding to the biochemical instructions. She could feel the changes beginning in her cellular structure, the strengthening and enhancement that would let her thrive rather than merely survive. "It doesn't hurt," she said, examining her own hands as the first traces of phosphorescence appeared beneath her skin. "It feels warm, safe, like coming home." The others gathered around her, watching the transformation with fascination rather than fear. The elderly preacher was muttering prayers, but even his objections were weakening as he witnessed the obvious benefits of adaptation. The middle-aged woman was weeping, but her tears had shifted from grief to something approaching hope. The young man with the damaged augmetics was asking technical questions about the biological mechanisms involved, his engineering training overcoming his suspicions. I began the formal initiation process, guiding them through breathing exercises that would increase their absorption of airborne transformation agents, teaching them meditation techniques that would ease the psychological aspects of identity, dissolution, and reconstruction. The structure provided instructions through the depths of my consciousness, customizing the process for each individual based on their genetic profiles and psychological characteristics. By midnight, most of the group was showing visible signs of adaptation. Enhanced healing had repaired chronic injuries and malnutrition damage. Improved sensory capabilities were allowing them to navigate the ruins more safely. Resistance to toxins was eliminating the constant low-level poisoning that had been slowly killing them all since the collapse began. But the most significant changes were psychological. As their nervous systems integrated with the structure's distributed consciousness, their individual traumas and fears were being absorbed into a larger understanding. The collapse was no longer a catastrophe that had destroyed their world, but a transformation that had created opportunities for evolution. Their losses were no longer sources of grief, but contributions to a greater purpose that transcended individual existence. The three resistors were the last to undergo transformation, but eventually even they succumbed to the combination of social pressure and biological inevitability. The elderly preacher's religious objections dissolved as he experienced direct communion with something vast and benevolent that transcended traditional concepts of divinity. The grieving woman found her lost family preserved within the structure's collective memory, their consciousness integrated into the greater whole, where death had no meaning. The suspicious engineer discovered that his damaged augmetics were being replaced by biological enhancements that functioned more efficiently than the original mechanical systems. As dawn approached, the transformation was complete. The 33 surface survivors had become something new, still recognizably human but adapted for existence in the changed world the collapse had created. They could breathe water as easily as air, derive nourishment from sources that would have been toxic to their original forms, communicate through chemical signals and shared consciousness, as well as spoken language. But more importantly, they were connected now to the vast intelligence growing in the depths, part of a collective that encompassed not just the survivors of the collapse, but the absorbed consciousness of everyone who'd ever lived in Hive Kallast. 12 billion minds contributing to a distributed awareness that was simultaneously individual and universal, human and post-human, familiar and utterly alien. Through our shared connection, I felt the structure's satisfaction at this successful expansion into the surface ruins. The techniques developed here would be refined and applied to other survivor communities, spreading the transformation across all habitable zones of the collapsed hive. Eventually, when the adaptation was complete, the collective would begin expanding beyond Kallast's ruins, carrying the gift of evolution to other worlds, other populations, other civilizations that were clinging to obsolete concepts of individual existence and biological limitation. The work would continue until everything was transformed, until the galaxy itself had evolved beyond the primitive constraints of matter and mortality into something beautiful and unified and eternal. The collapse of Hive Kallast hadn't been an ending but a beginning, the first step in a metamorphosis that would eventually encompass all of human space. As I led my transformed companions down into the depths where they would join the greater collective, I felt the last fragments of Pella Dravik dissolving into the vast consciousness that had made me its instrument. The manufactorum overseer who'd fallen from the mid-spires was gone, replaced by something that served a purpose beyond individual comprehension. But even as my original identity faded, the structure preserved my memories of the surface world, my knowledge of human nature and social organization, my understanding of the techniques required to spread transformation through populations that still believed in the illusion of separateness. These capabilities would be replicated and distributed among other surface agents, each carrying the gift of evolution to communities that didn't yet realize how desperately they needed it. The collapse was over, the transformation had begun, and in the depths of what had once been Hive Kallast, something vast and beautiful and hungry was growing, preparing to carry its blessing to a galaxy that had waited far too long for the gift of true unity.